December 1944. English Channel airspace, 14,000 feet. Scans his assigned sector. The procedure is automatic after 18 months of combat. Eyes sweep left across a 120-degree arc, 8 seconds per scan, then return to check instruments. His training promised that threats become visible at 400 yards in clear conditions. Today's visibility exceeds 10 kilometers. 300 yards to his left, his wingman holds position. Behind them, 7 more M. Combat spread. The formation occupies nearly a cubic mile of airspace. Standard doctrine. Everyone follows it perfectly. Completes another scan. Empty sky in all directions. Radio chatter confirms what his eyes tell him, sector clear. He checks altitude, 14,200 feet. Airspeed, 310 kilometers per hour. All instruments nominal. Aircraft explodes without warning. No tracer rounds. No engine roar preceding the attack. No radio call of contact. Just converting from flying machine to falling debris in the time it takes to blink. His radio erupts with confused voices. Someone shouts coordinates. Another pilot calls out a visual search pattern. His head swivels through the sector had been guarding. He sees nothing. 17 seconds later, the next aircraft dies. This time is looking in the right direction. He watches his squadron mate's canopy shatter, sees the roll inverted, its pilot slumped or dead. What he doesn't see, what none of them see, is the aircraft that fired the killing burst. His eyes track the bullet paths backward through three-dimensional space, trying to locate the source. The geometry makes no sense. The angle suggests a position 200 yards behind the victim, but had scanned that exact volume of sky 6 seconds ago. It was empty. The formation breaks. 9 aircraft scatter into individual survival patterns, each pilot executing the violent maneuvers meant to deny a tracking solution to a pursuing enemy. But there's nothing to deny. They're evading an invisible opponent. Rolls his hard right, pulls back on the stick, climbs while scanning. His eyes sweep the sky with the desperation of a man who knows he's being hunted, but can't see the hunter. By the time he levels out at 16,000 feet, 3 aircraft from his formation are falling. The remaining 6 Germans flee east toward occupied France, their radios crackling with reports that make no tactical sense. The word they keep repeating, invisible, will appear in their after-action reports. Intelligence officers will read these reports with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Invisible aircraft belong in propaganda, not operational analysis. But the mathematics are undeniable. 1 American fighter, 9 German aircraft, 90 seconds of combat, 3 kills. 0 visual contact with the attacker. The question that will consume Allied intelligence for weeks is deceptively simple. How does a fighter aircraft become invisible in an open sky? The winter of 1944 arrived over Western Europe with particular cruelty. Fog banks rolled across the channel with the weight of wet wool, settling into valleys and clinging to hedgerows until noon. When the sun did break through, it offered little warmth, only enough light to reveal the gray expanse of a continent at war. Above this landscape, the air war had reached grinding intensity. American bomber formations crossed into occupied territory daily, their contrails scratching white lines across the stratosphere. Below them, at medium altitudes, fighter escorts wove protective patterns. And lower still, where clouds broke and reformed, reconnaissance aircraft and fighter bombers hunted for targets of opportunity. The English Channel served as both highway and graveyard. Every crossing carried risk. German fighters operated from bases in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Their radar stations dotted the coastline. Flak batteries protected every bridge, rail junction, and fuel depot. For American pilots, the mathematics were unforgiving. Every mission subtracted something from the odds of survival. The Marine Corps presence in this theater was unusual. Most Marine aviators fought in the Pacific, where the island-hopping campaign demanded close air support and carrier operations. But a small contingent had been attached to joint operations in Europe, flying missions that ranged from escort duty to ground attack. They brought with them aircraft designed for a different war entirely. The F-4U Corsair had been built for the vast distances of the Pacific. Its massive and Whitney R-2800 engine generated over 2,000 horsepower, giving it the speed and climb rate needed to intercept Japanese fighters at extreme range. Its inverted gull wings, designed to accommodate a massive propeller while keeping landing gear short enough for carrier decks, gave it an unmistakable silhouette against any sky. In European service, the Corsair was an oddity. Most American fighters over France and Germany were P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs, aircraft that had become synonymous with Allied air superiority. The Corsair's appearance drew curiosity from both friend and foe. German pilots had studied recognition charts filled with American aircraft types, but the bent-wing shape of the Corsair was rare enough to create confusion. This confusion would prove consequential. The pattern emerged within 5 days. German intelligence officers compiled reports from 3 separate engagements. Each incident followed the same impossible sequence. American fighter appeared from nowhere, killed between 2 and 4 German aircraft, vanished before defensive response could be organized. Survivors described the attacks with remarkable consistency. No engine noise preceded contact. No visual acquisition at ranges that should have guaranteed detection. The American simply materialized within firing range, executed his attack, and disappeared. What made these reports noteworthy was the weather condition shared across all 3 engagements: broken cloud cover between 8,000 and 15,000 feet. Weber commanded the intelligence section responsible for threat analysis at 3 headquarters. He had spent the previous 2 years tracking Allied fighter tactics, learning to distinguish genuine innovations from combat confusion. Most mystery encounters resolved into mundane explanations once pilots calmed down and wrote detailed reports. This case was different. The consistency across independent witnesses suggested something more than combat stress. Weber spread reconnaissance photographs across his desk. Each showed the channel sector where attacks had occurred. He traced cloud formations with his finger, noting their density and altitude. The correlation was undeniable. Every engagement happened in condition where cumulus clouds provided potential concealment between 10,000 and 14,000 feet. The theory that formed seemed logically airtight. The American was using clouds as mobile cover. He would position himself within or just below cloud formations, using them as a screen while scanning for German formations in clear air below. When he identified a target, he would descend through the cloud base, achieve firing position while German pilots' attention was focused on open sky, execute a high-speed attack, and climb back into cloud cover before defenders could acquire him visually. The theory explained everything. The lack of engine noise, because he was descending with throttle reduced, using altitude for energy rather than power. The sudden appearance, because he was emerging from opaque concealment into clear air. The rapid disappearance, because he was climbing back into the same clouds that had hidden his initial approach. Weber's analysis convinced his superiors. The solution seemed obvious: position fighter screens above the cloud layer. If the American was using clouds as concealment, then fighters positioned at 18,000 to 20,000 feet would spot him as he moved between cloud formations. The vertical separation would provide adequate warning time and eliminate his concealment advantage. The new patrol protocol was implemented on December 18th. 8 190s took station at 19,000 feet, maintaining a defensive cap above a group of flying bomber intercept patrol at 13,000 feet. Weather conditions were identical to previous engagements, broken clouds between 10,000 and 15,000 feet. The high patrol had clear visibility. Their mission was simple: watch the cloud layer, call out any aircraft emerging from it, vector the lower patrol to intercept. At 14:37 hours, the radio erupted with combat calls from the lower formation. The high patrol immediately scanned the cloud formations below them. They saw in formation. They saw the enemy aircraft attacking them. What they didn't see was any American fighter emerging from the clouds they were supposed to be monitoring. The engagement was happening in clear air, well below the cloud base, at 11,000 feet. The radio transcript captured the confusion. Where did he come from? High patrol, do you have visual? Negative, negative, checking cloud layer. He's not in the clouds, he's at our altitude. How did he? The transmission ended mid-sentence. That pilot's aircraft was among the 4 that fell during the 90-second engagement. The American killed 4 of them, damaged 2 more, and vanished. The high patrol, still searching clouds for an emerging threat, never acquired visual contact with an aircraft that had never used cloud cover in the first place. Weber's theory had failed its first operational test. But the failure itself provided data. The American wasn't using clouds. His concealment technique operated in clear air. The mystery had deepened rather than resolved. What doctrine addressed an enemy who could achieve invisibility without any environmental concealment to hide behind? The intelligence section began reviewing the reports again, this time searching for a different pattern. If not clouds, then what? The surviving pilots were questioned more intensively. Times, altitudes, sun positions, approach directions, every detail was cataloged and analyzed. The officers doing this analysis were methodical men trained to think in terms of physics and geometry. Invisible aircraft violated their understanding of how aerial combat functioned. But somewhere in their data, a new pattern was beginning to emerge. It would take them another week to identify it, and when they did, they would be wrong again. The second pattern revealed itself through simple geometry. Weber's team had marked every attack location on a large-scale map of the Channel sector. They had noted the time of each engagement. When they combined these 2 data points with sun position tables, something jumped out. Every attack had occurred between 1400 and 1600 hours. Every attack had placed the American fighter on a specific bearing relative to his targets. And in every case, that bearing positioned the attacker between the German formation and the afternoon sun. This wasn't coincidence, this was tactics. The theory formed quickly. American pilot positions himself west of his targets during afternoon patrol hours, descends to attack altitude with the sun directly behind him. German pilots scanning for threats are forced to look into bright sky, their eyes dazzled, their ability to detect silhouettes severely compromised. The American approaches from the sun line, achieves firing position while German vision is degraded, makes his attack, and disengages before defenders can reorient and acquire him visually. The tactic had historical precedent. Had emphasized attacking out of the sun 26 years earlier. Every fighter pilot learned this principle in basic training. Had written it into his tactical dicta in 1916. When possible, attack with the sun behind you. The American was simply executing textbook tactics with unusual consistency. But this theory explained more than just the invisibility. It explained the timing, afternoon hours when sun angle was optimal. It explained the approach direction, always from the western sector. It explained why cloud cover patterns hadn't mattered during the last engagement, because the American wasn't using clouds, he was using sunlight as his concealment medium. The countermeasure was equally obvious. Position defensive patrols to keep the sun behind them during the critical afternoon hours. If the American could only attack effectively from the sun direction, then formations that maintained eastward-facing positions would force him to approach through clear sky with no solar dazzle to hide behind. He would become visible at normal detection ranges. His advantage would evaporate. The new protocol was briefed to every squadron operating channel patrols. Between 1400 and 1600 hours, formations would maintain patrol patterns that kept them east of likely threat axes. If contact was made, the initial response would be to turn toward the sun, forcing any attacker to silhouette himself against bright sky. The Germans would accept the temporary vision degradation in exchange for forcing the American into a position where he was backlit rather than shadow-hidden. On December 23rd, Ernst Becker led a 6-aircraft patrol with explicit instructions to test the sun angle countermeasure. His formation maintained position southeast of Cap, keeping the afternoon sun to their backs. Becker was experienced enough to understand the theory behind the tactic and disciplined enough to maintain formation integrity, even when it felt like his patrol was playing bait in a carefully constructed trap. At 1447 hours, his wingman died. The attack came from the northeast, Not from the sun, not from any direction that matched the predicted pattern. The American was approaching from the dark sector, from the direction where silhouettes should have been starkest, from the bearing that put him against gray cloud and darker water rather than bright sky. Becker's formation scattered, each pilot reacting with practiced violence, but the confusion was total. They had positioned themselves to counter a sun-direction attack. Their visual scan patterns, their formation spacing, their defensive doctrine, all of it had been oriented around the assumption that threat would come from the west. Instead, the American was in the one quadrant they had specifically designated as safe, because it offered no solar concealment. The engagement lasted 78 seconds, 2 aircraft destroyed. One damaged badly enough that the pilot barely made it back to base. The American vanished, not by climbing into sun glare, but by simply accelerating away through what should have been the clearest air in their sector. Becker's radio report, delivered in the clipped tones of someone trying to maintain composure, included a detail that intelligence would find deeply troubling. I was looking directly at his altitude. I was scanning the sector he attacked from. I should have seen him at 1,000 meters minimum. I saw nothing until he opened fire at 300 meters. This wasn't sun dazzle. This wasn't cloud concealment. This was something else entirely. Weber read the report twice. Then he walked to the window of his office and stared at the winter sky. Somewhere out there was an American pilot who had systematically invalidated 2 carefully reasoned tactical theories. Cloud concealment, proven wrong. Sun angle approach, proven wrong. Both theories had made perfect sense. Both had been supported by evidence. Both had suggested clear countermeasures. Both countermeasures had failed. What troubled Weber most was the implication. If the Americans' advantage wasn't environmental, if it didn't depend on clouds or sun position or any external factor, then it was intrinsic to his aircraft or his tactics. Something about the way he flew, or the aircraft he flew, was making him harder to see than physics and human vision should allow. But what could make an aircraft invisible in clear air? Weber had access to recognition manuals showing every American fighter type. He knew the dimensions, performance specifications, and visual profiles of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings. He had interviewed dozens of pilots who had engaged American fighters at every altitude and lighting condition. Nothing in his accumulated knowledge suggested any aircraft type possessed inherent camouflage beyond whatever paint scheme the Americans chose to apply. Paint scheme. The thought arrived with the quiet certainty of something that had been obvious all along, hidden only by the assumption that no one would bother with something so simple. What if the American hadn't been innovating tactics? What if he had been innovating appearance? But even as the question formed, Weber dismissed it. Camouflage paint was standard on all combat aircraft. German fighters wore their own schemes, dark greens and grays on top, light blue on bottom. The Americans used similar principles. There was nothing revolutionary available in that direction. Just the same mundane compromises between visibility against sky and visibility against ground that every air force had been making since aircraft started shooting at each other. Whatever the American secret was, Weber decided it had to be something more sophisticated than paint. He was wrong. But he wouldn't learn that for another 2 weeks. The American pilot who had created this mystery was named James, though that name would remain buried in classified documents for months after the war ended. What mattered to Weber's intelligence section was not his identity, but his methodology. And that methodology had begun with something far more mundane than anyone hunting for it would have guessed. It had begun with paint. Not tactical paint schemes designed by engineers and approved by procurement officers. Not the standard 3-color patterns that appeared in technical manuals and were applied by maintenance crews at depot facilities. This was something closer to art than to doctrine. Had been studying the problem of aircraft visibility for nearly 8 months before he painted his Corsair. The obsession had started in the Pacific, during his first combat tour, when he had noticed something peculiar about visual acquisition ranges. Japanese fighters flying against tropical sky seemed to appear at different distances depending on their color schemes. Some aircraft became visible at 2,000 yards, others not until 1,000. A few seemed to materialize at ranges under 500 yards. The differences weren't random. They correlated with specific paint combinations and lighting conditions. Began documenting every aerial engagement he witnessed or participated in, noting aircraft types, paint schemes, background conditions, and reported acquisition ranges. By the time he rotated back to the United States for instructor duty in early 1944, he had filled 3 notebooks with observations that most pilots would have dismissed as irrelevant detail, but had spent 4 years before the war working in his family's commercial painting business, not houses, industrial equipment. Water towers, storage tanks, machinery that had to survive weather while remaining visible for safety reasons or invisible for aesthetic ones. He understood something that most pilots and engineers never considered. Human eyes don't see objects, they see contrast. An aircraft isn't visible because of its color. It's visible because its color creates contrast against whatever background it's flying in front of. Change the contrast, and you change the detection range. Reduce the contrast enough, and you can make a 30-foot aircraft functionally invisible until it closes to point-blank range. The principle had been understood since World War I. Camouflage schemes had always attempted to minimize contrast. But they did so through compromise, trying to find colors that worked adequately against both sky and ground, accepting reduced effectiveness in exchange for versatility. Insight was simpler and more radical. Stop compromising. Optimize for exactly one background. Accept that your camouflage would be useless against other backgrounds. And then never allow yourself to be seen against those other backgrounds. The background that mattered in European air combat was sky. Not ground, not clouds, not varying conditions, just sky, specifically the gray winter sky between 10,000 and 18,000 feet where most fighter engagements occurred. German pilots scanning for threats were looking at that sky. If an American aircraft could minimize its contrast against that specific background, it would become harder to detect. Not invisible, physics didn't allow for invisibility, but delayed. Every second of delayed detection was a second of tactical advantage. Spent weeks studying color theory, mixing paints, testing samples against sky at different altitudes and lighting conditions. The work was tedious and precise. He wasn't trying to find a color that looked like sky. Sky wasn't one color. It shifted constantly with altitude, sun angle, weather, time of day. What he needed was a color that maintained minimum contrast across the widest range of those variations. The answer was a specific shade of blue-gray that appeared in no military color chart. It was lighter than standard camouflage gray, but not as pale as identification markings. It had a slight blue cast that matched the scattering of high-altitude atmosphere without being overtly blue. And it required 3 separate mixing iterations before, was satisfied that he had the exact shade he needed. When he returned to Europe for his second combat tour, he brought 5 gallons of his custom mixture with him. His squadron commander was skeptical but not prohibitive. Unauthorized paint schemes violated regulations, but they didn't threaten mission success. If wanted to waste time painting his aircraft in some peculiar shade, that was his choice. The commander's only requirement was that standard identification markings remained visible, national insignia, squadron codes, aircraft number. Painted his Corsair over a 3-day period in November 1944. He worked alone, applying the paint in thin, even coats, ensuring complete coverage of every surface visible from above or from the sides. The underside remained standard light gray. There was no point optimizing against ground background since he never planned to be seen from below. This wasn't camouflage for ground attack. This was camouflage for air combat, where the enemy was always at your altitude or above it, always scanning horizontal or down, never up. The difference was immediate and dramatic. On his first mission with the new paint scheme, maneuvered into position behind a German formation without being detected until he opened fire. On his second mission, he achieved the same result. By his 5th mission, German pilots were reporting attacks from invisible aircraft. By his 10th mission, intelligence was compiling reports trying to explain the impossibility. What made the technique effective wasn't just the paint. It was the paint combined with disciplined tactics. Never attacked from below, where his light gray underside would silhouette against darker ground. He never attacked from directions that put him against clouds, where any solid object would create visible outline. He positioned himself in clear sky, at his target's altitude or slightly above, approaching from angles that placed him against continuous gray atmosphere. From that position, his aircraft didn't disappear. It simply failed to register as distinct from background until range closed to a few hundred yards. German pilots scanning for threats were looking for the familiar silhouettes they had learned to recognize, the distinctive profiles of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, the gull wings of Corsairs. What they were seeing was gray shape against gray sky, contrast so minimal that their eyes couldn't resolve it into recognizable form until far too late. The psychology worked in his favor. Pilots expected to see threats at 800 to 1,000 yards. When they didn't, they assumed the sector was clear. They didn't keep searching the same volume of sky. They moved on to scan other sectors, would hold position, patient, waiting for their attention to shift away. Then he would close to 300 yards and open fire. The Germans weren't failing to see because of clouds or sun position. They were failing to see because there was almost nothing to see, just a gray object moving against gray background, its edges softened by the atmospheric scattering that made high-altitude air itself slightly opaque. The physics of the concealment were simple. The execution required only paint and discipline. But the effect was devastating. Weber's intelligence section eventually solved the mystery, but not until January 1945, after had completed his tour and returned to the United States. A captured American pilot, shot down during a ground attack mission, happened to mention the ghost Corsair during interrogation. The reference was casual, combat gossip about a pilot who had supposedly painted his aircraft some special color. German intelligence pursued the thread. Within 2 weeks, they had confirmed the mechanism. By then, it was too late to matter. The war had less than 4 months remaining. And James had already recorded 15 kills, using a technique that required nothing more sophisticated than correct paint and patient positioning. The Germans had been right to search for a complex explanation. In warfare, decisive advantages usually came from technology, from engineering, from systematic innovation. But sometimes they came from something simpler, from understanding what the human eye actually sees, and taking advantage of the 300-millisecond delay between seeing and comprehending. The technique would be studied after the war by researchers interested in visual perception and military camouflage. It demonstrated a principle that had been understood theoretically but rarely applied with such precision. That visibility is not a property of objects but a relationship between object, background, and observer. Change any element of that triangle, and detection ranges shift dramatically. Modern aircraft camouflage still uses these principles, though technology has added layers of complexity. Radar-absorbent materials, infrared suppression, digital camouflage patterns, all of them descendants of simple insight about contrast and human vision. But in the winter of 1944, over the gray waters of the English Channel, the principle was new enough to seem like magic. And for the German pilots who died without seeing their killer, it might as well have been.